You are now listening to Macrodose.
Hello and welcome to Macrodose, a podcast hosted by me, James Meadway, that brings you your weekly fix of everything economics in a quick 15-minute roundup. In today's episode, we'll be looking at, first, Keir Starmer is on the way out and Andy Burnham is on his way in, but what does his economic agenda really look like? Second, the current heatwave gripping the UK and large parts of the rest of Europe. And third, with movements growing against data centre construction, what's the latest daft idea for where to put them? Our first story this week is the near-inevitable arrival of Andy Burnham in number 10 Downing Street, following his thumping victory in the Makerfield by-election and Keir Starmer's resignation. Senior Labour figures are keen to avoid a leadership election, and assuming there is no contest for the position of Labour leader, Burnham will become Prime Minister on 17th of July. If there is a contest, it'll be more like 1st of September, after a long summer leadership battle that would, judging by the polling of Labour's membership, almost certainly return Andy Burnham as winner in any case. Attention is turning to what Burnham plans to do in government. He said a lot that many listeners will agree with, particularly on the failures of neoliberalism and privatisation, and on the failure to invest in much of the country. It's also fair to say that Burnham has moved politically a fair distance from the Blairite special advisor and later cabinet minister he once was in the 2000s, to the advocate for what he calls Manchesterism today. As Health Secretary, he was an early advocate for a national care service, and he was offering some mild criticisms of Blairism in his first run for the Labour leadership back in 2010. For what it's worth, I remember him being a supportive member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet as Shadow Home Secretary before he resigned to campaign for the new position of Greater Manchester Mayor. If he's popular across the country, it's from the role he carved out for himself there, and perhaps especially during COVID, when he was seen as fighting the corner for Manchester and the North West against an erratic Westminster government. It's the experience of being mayor, in particular, that Burnham himself cites as making him sharp in his opposition to neoliberal economics. He also has Miatta Fahnbulleh, former chief executive of the New Economics Foundation and now a South London MP, advising him on policy, along with Caris Roberts and others from the more radical end of the London policy world. Matt Lawrence and Alex Williams have just published their report on The Productive State, published by new Burnhamite think tank and campaign group Mainstream. It's been talked up by The Guardian as a blueprint for Manchesterism that would, quote, reverse 40 years of privatisation, and I'll come back to that paper in a second. Burnham's team have announced that Jim O'Neill, the Labour-supporting former Goldman Sachs chief economist and former Bank of England chief economist Andy Haldane, will be taking up posts as economic advisors, and perhaps even be offered ministerial positions. Again, this can be read as politically smart. Both arrive with unimpeachable financial market credentials, but both are actually relatively heterodox thinkers. O'Neill in particular has favoured heavy public investment to redress the wild geographic inequalities of the British economy, and could even be found, back in October 2018, praising Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell as having, quote, caught the mood of the country. All that said, the pressures to push Burnham away from even his fairly mild criticisms of free market capitalism are already intense. His quip that we should not, quote, be in hock to the bond markets has been, unfairly taken out of its context, predictably used to bludgeon him and those around him. Every wobble in the price of the pound or the cost of government borrowing in the last few weeks has been used by one Tory paper, The Telegraph, and one paper that ought to know better, The Financial Times, to talk up the supposed perils of a Burnham premiership. His preferred choice of Chancellor is the soft left, Ed Miliband, who, as a former Treasury Special Advisor under Gordon Brown, and one of the few ministers under Starmer who can point to genuine successes in the last 2 years, would be a relatively smart appointment, something I saw even former Treasury Permanent Secretary Nick Macpherson acknowledge in the last week. This hasn't stopped a great deal of agitation for the right-wingers Wes Streeting or Shabana Mahmood to take the post, although for what it's worth I suspect Miliband will still get it. This is, I think, where what could otherwise be a relatively optimistic prospect for economic policy starts to come undone. Burnham is due to make a major speech on the economy next week, which, according to the Times, will confirm his commitment to the existing fiscal rule that regulates the amount that government can borrow. Matt and Alex, in their Productive State paper, suggest government should make the same commitment, keeping Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules in place. Unlike some on the left, I don't view this as greatly problematic. Far too much has been made about the fiscal rules as a major source of our collective economic woes. They are allegedly holding back government from spending and borrowing as much as it might want to restore public services, provide investment, and perhaps boost growth. If we changed or even scrapped the rules, the government could borrow more. There's no doubt the rules could be better designed in various ways. We could free up a little more borrowing, perhaps with some careful changes, well telegraphed in advance to reduce the scope for bond market panic. But the hard truth is that the British economy is in a bad state with or without those rules, and the costs of government borrowing here, as elsewhere, have risen sharply. It's nothing to do with Andy Burnham that government borrowing costs have roughly quintupled in France, Germany, Italy, and the US, but a lot to do with rising inflation and the significant debts all major developed economies have built up. Borrowing more will cost more than it used to, and this is the real barrier on government borrowing, at least until we have in place institutions like, for example, a national investment bank that could look to lend for long-term investment in public transport or energy generation, for instance. Britain will remain particularly exposed to the international bond markets because, fundamentally, we have a heavy dependence on importing essentials like food, and so have a significant exposure to exchange rate movements, and from there to changes in sentiment on the bond markets. Yanis Varoufakis has a useful long thread on X, formerly known as Twitter, explaining this. So the fiscal rules aren't the problem. Given the state of the economy and its international exposures, it makes sense to limit the potential for a massive bond market and exchange rate blow-up. Within that framework, however, it will be necessary to make some big changes, notably including to where the balance of taxes land, but also, as Matt and Alex argue, to how major assets are owned, especially those for essentials, which they list as housing, water, and transport. And it's here that I think the Burnham premiership will run into difficulties. Whether it will really have the political will to do even half of what the productive state talks about is a little moot. I have my doubts. But the bigger issue is what neither that pamphlet, nor those close to Burnham, nor Burnham himself talk about, and that is the incipient crisis in the food system. I am speaking on potentially the hottest June day on record in the UK. El Niño has been confirmed as happening for this year. Pacific Ocean temperatures are soaring way above their normal levels, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, now perhaps getting reopened, has disrupted around 1/3 of the globe's fertilizer trade. Put all this together, and the next 6 to 12 months, probably from autumn onwards, look like ones of severe disruption to the world's agriculture. That means disrupted supplies of food and, quite likely, soaring prices. Matt and Alex gloss over this in their pamphlet, airily choosing to believe that the UK's free market food system will simply manage with yet another significant global shock. Burnham, I don't think, ever mentions food amongst his essentials of life, yet food prices are already what people report as a major component of the cost of living crisis, even before a potential surge and disruptions out of the end of this year. I hope to be proved wrong, and that either a sudden shock or a somewhat steadier grind of food prices upwards would be met with some creativity and determination by the new government, especially after Starmer's administration predictably ran away from even voluntary arrangements with the supermarkets to better regulate prices. Other countries are already doing this, Greece and France in Europe, and economist Isabella Weber has highlighted Mexico's price control system. But it's no use having grand schemes to return essential assets like the water system back into public hands if you can't address the immediate crisis people face. Second for us this week is how the UK and much of Europe is currently in the grip of a severe heatwave driven by a persistent heat dome. A rare extreme heat red warning has been issued by the UK's Met Office, indicating a danger to life. Long-standing June temperature records are forecast to be broken by the 25th, with 40 degrees expected. a temperature previously unimaginable in this country before 2022, but now rapidly becoming painfully normalised. The effects of this on public health are enormous, both directly in the risks posed from heat exhaustion and indirectly in the worsening of underlying conditions like respiratory illnesses. More people died as a result of the 2022 heatwave than were killed in road accidents that year. French authorities report 40 deaths by drowning in the last few days, as desperate people take to unsafe water courses to cool off. What we're starting to see appearing is something novel, a politics of extreme weather. Heat waves are political, and I don't just mean that in the big sense that these repeated, worsening bouts of extreme heat are plausibly attributable to human-caused climate change. I mean that who suffers and how they suffer is political. Air conditioning access is one version of this. There are about 2 billion air conditioning units in the world, using about 7% of all electricity generated. Half of them are in the United States, and ownership skews predictably towards the upper end of the income scale, both in the US and across the world. Almost the entirety of Pakistan's air conditioning units are held by the richest third of the population, for example. As extreme heat worsens, demands for air conditioning will grow, bringing significant consequences for electricity demand, with a typical aircon unit using around 20 times the energy of a fan. There's also the classic problem of air conditioners' contribution to urban heat sinks, raising, as they do, the temperature of the surrounding air by an appreciable amount. Anyone who has walked past a row of wall-mounted aircon units on a summer's day will know this. The fight over who gets air conditioning and under what conditions will become a defining one here as across Europe. But there is also the wider fight, correctly raised by Jean-Luc Mélenchon and France Insoumise, for the redesign of our cities and buildings to better cope with extreme heat, for example in greening and tree planting across urban areas. However, what I want to flag here is a more immediate response to extreme heat, which is to enforce the rule that workplaces should not operate when there is a risk to employees' health. In UK law, this is Section 44 of the 1996 Employment Rights Act, which explicitly provides the right for an employee to remove themselves from a workplace where they believe there to be an immediate risk to their own health and safety. As temperatures soar, that covers more and more poorly ventilated, non-air-conditioned workplaces, from buses to schools to office blocks. If it's too hot to work, legally, you do not have to work. Union members across the UK have called for a heat strike to enforce this, with the Met Office extreme heat warning in place from Tuesday to Thursday this week. Their website has the resources activists need to explain and promote the law, and you can find it at heatstrike.notion.site. Our third and final story this week picks up on the ludicrous idea of putting data centres into orbit. The alleged benefits include ready access to solar power and freedom from pesky regulations and growing protests back on Earth. SpaceX's IPO last week made heavy play of its plans to launch a network of AI data centers in space. The downsides are immense. They range from the limited cooling available in the vacuum of space to the slow transmission speeds and bandwidth available for data transmission between Earth and even relatively low orbit, to the high costs of actually launching anything. Another difficulty was flagged in an intriguing report in Quartz last week, which said this, I quote, "About 44,870 objects are now tracked by space surveillance networks, according to the European Space Agency's Space Debris User Portal. Of those, only about 9,300 are active satellites. The rest is debris, spent rocket stages, dead spacecraft, fragments from explosions and collisions. Those are just the objects large enough to track. ESA's debris model estimates 1.2 million objects between 1 and 10 centimeters in size and 140 million smaller than 1 centimeter. A 1 centimeter fragment at orbital velocity carries enough energy to destroy a satellite. SpaceX has filed for permission to launch up to 1 million orbital data centers. But another of Elon Musk's ventures, Starlink, is already beset by space junk. Starlink today manages about 3/4 of all maneuverable satellites in low Earth orbit. But as Quartz write, quote, its satellites executed about 300,000 collision avoidance maneuvers in 2025, a 50% increase from 2024. Each satellite now performs up to 40 maneuvers per year. Every maneuver burns propellant, shortens operational life, and introduces trajectory uncertainty for other operators. It's not clear anyone has a workable proposal to deal with this. The UN space debris mitigation guidelines aren't legally binding. The US Federal Communications Commission asks for satellites to be safely deorbited within 5 years of their operational life ending, but this isn't enforced. The European Space Agency has proposed active cleanup missions, scooping debris out of the sky to prevent collisions and the terrible potential for single collisions to become chain reactions of debris and satellites across the sky. But this is a classic collective action problem. Whilst it would be to the benefit of all the new private space companies to have cleaner orbits, precisely because all of them would benefit, it removes the incentive for any particular company to take on the task of the cleanup. This is another own goal for capitalism. Thank you for listening to today's show. Macrodose is a Planet B production. If you enjoyed the show and you'd recommend it to friends, please consider leaving us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all our episodes, including our bonus interview content, on our Patreon at patreon.com/macrodose.